Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. It's lovely to see so many faces, so many videos. Thank you very much for being here, even if you're a longtime participant or a member, or if you're joining us for the first time. We are very, very happy to have you here with us. I'll just say a very brief introduction about Qesher, which is this project that we created together with Sebastian. You can see us both here under the name Qesher, and our aim is to learn and teach and learn together about Jewish heritage, Jewish history, culture, and also the present day situation of Jewish life in all different parts of the world. We visit different cities and different countries through our virtual tours and lectures. And we also have our book club series, which is what you're going to see today, in which we invite authors who have written a book in this theme, which also touches on Jewish life around the world. We are very happy to welcome today Nick Sayers, who will be the author sharing about his book, The Jews of Lithuania. And I'll just very briefly introduce him and then I'll pass the word to him. He spent his working life as a corporate transactional lawyer and was a partner at several leading London law firms. He has a master's in historical research from Birkbeck and is an honorary fellow of the Parks Institute University in Southampton. Nick is a member of the advisory board of the Jewish Historical Society of England, and this book is the result of a personal quest to understand more about Nick's family background in Eastern Europe. It leads him to dig deeply into many of the big questions about modern Jewish history in Lithuania. The book was published on 26th of September 2024, and the full title is The Jews of Lithuania, A Journey Through the Long 20th Century. So welcome, Nick, and welcome, everyone. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and now I'll pass the word to Nick for the presentation, and we'll open it up for Q&A after the presentation. So, Nick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dora and Sebastian, for inviting me to talk to you this evening. And thank you to Dora for your very kind introduction, and to everyone at Qesher for making this evening possible. And thank you to all of you for listening. I'm often asked, why did I write this book? The first answer is that I saw it as a kind of retirement activity. I spent about 40 years as a lawyer involved in corporate transactional legal work. I always knew that I would not be able to continue this much beyond the age of 60. It is very intense work, and many of the better English law firms discourage partners from continuing much beyond that age. But a second and perhaps more important reason for writing this book is that, like a lot of people as they grow older, I found myself asking the deeper question, where do I come from? And in common with many people of Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, I knew little about it. There are a number of reasons why I and other descendants of Lithuanian Jews know relatively little. The generation of Jewish people who left Lithuania in the late 19th century, which in my case is my great-grandfather, tended not to talk much about their past. They regarded the past as poverty-stricken and filled with fear of violence against them. The First World War was a shattering experience for Lithuanian Jews, as most of the community was exiled almost from one day to the next deep into Russia. The Holocaust largely destroyed the Lithuanian Jewish community. About 96% of the pre-war Jewish community was murdered, the highest proportion of Jews killed in any country. And in the post-war world, the fact that Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union until 1990 made it almost impossible to study that history dispassionately. So, in common with many people with Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, I found I knew relatively little about that Lithuanian Jewish background. My book is not family history. Instead, it tries to do something which is perhaps slightly unusual. I take the outline of the experience of the paternal line of the family as a way of choosing the wider subjects to write about. My great-grandfather, Meyer, was born and brought up in what is now northern Lithuania, in a tiny village, a shtetl, which is called Pikeliai in Lithuanian and Pikeln in Yiddish. If I could have the next slide, please. Here are a few pictures of it. From left to right, an old house formerly owned by Jewish people, the old Jewish cemetery in which generations of the Jewish community were buried, and the site of the old synagogue. In the early 1890s, my great-grandfather moved from Pikeliai in northern Lithuania to Cork in Southern Ireland. And in 1905, he and other family members moved again, but this time from Cork to Dublin. My grandfather, known as JD, trained as a doctor in Dublin, but unable to find work there, joined the British Navy before buying into a GP practice in New Cross in South London, where my father was brought up, before the family moved in the early post-war period to Blackheath in South London. In my book, I use this outline of the family experience as a way of looking at a number of questions concerning the modern history of Jews in Lithuania. If I could have the next slide, please. Some of the questions are: why were there large numbers of Jews living in Lithuania in the late 19th century? What was their life like? Was it the kind of shtetl existence depicted in Fiddler on the Roof? Or was it something rather different? Why did life become more difficult for Jews in late 19th century Lithuania, and why and how did they emigrate? What happened to Jewish people left behind in Lithuania during the First World War? How and why did the Holocaust happen in Lithuania? And how has Lithuanian government and society tried to come to terms with Lithuanians' involvement in the Holocaust? In the time available today, I would like to try and say just a few things in response to those questions. So the first question is, why were there large numbers of Jews living in Lithuania in the late 19th century? Part of the answer is that medieval European society was often a very difficult place for Jews to live in. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from Hungary in 1360, from Austria in 1420 to 21, from Spain in 1490, and from Portugal in 1496. At different times, Jews were expelled from many of the German states. However, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which occupied a great swathe of Central and Eastern Europe in what is now Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland, was for many years a relatively safe and comfortable place for Jews to live, and many Jews found refuge there. In the first half of the 14th century, Grand Duke Gediminas encountered Jews while campaigning in Galicia, and he invited Jews to settle in what is now part of Lithuania. Gediminas's grandson, Vytautas, actively welcomed Jewish settlement, and it was during his rule that a Jewish community of some substance became established in Lithuania. In other words, the so-called Lithuanian Jewish Commonwealth was relatively welcoming to Jews. This may have been connected to the fact that for a long time Lithuania was pagan, not Christian. Indeed, Lithuania spent many years resisting German attempts to conquer and Christianize it during the so-called Northern Crusades, and it was the last European country to cease being pagan in the late 14th century. Jews had a very particular role in Lithuanian society. Much of the land was owned by Polish nobility, many of whom were absent. Ethnic Lithuanians tended to be poor and worked on the land. Jews occupied a middle position, often as suppliers of goods and services. There was a kind of symbiotic relationship between Jews and Polish nobles. The nobles needed Jews to run their estates and make a success of the towns and villages established on their lands, and the nobles valued the revenues which the Jews produced. In return, the nobles gave the Jews a measure of protection, and for many years the Jews enjoyed relative control over their own affairs in Lithuania. Travelers from the West who went to Eastern Europe in the late 18th century were struck by the numbers of Jews they saw and by how hard they worked. The relatively comfortable position of Jews in Lithuania was to change rather fundamentally with the so-called Third Partition of Poland in 1795. From that date, Lithuania came under Russian control, and Russia was run by Tsars who were highly autocratic, and many of them were not well disposed to Jews. From that time, Jewish life became more difficult. My second question is whether Jewish life in mid to late 19th century Lithuania was like that depicted in Fiddler on the Roof, or was it changing and modernizing? I think there was change, and much of this was being brought about by the so-called Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. The devotees of this movement were known as maskilim. The aims of Haskalah were both to reform Jewish custom and also to reform the relationship between the Jewish world and Russian government and society. It sought the continued existence of a distinct Jewish community, but one which was updated and reformed, and which, it was hoped, would therefore have easier interaction with the surrounding society. It was in the nature of Haskalah that it could be taken up by individuals or small groups in remote communities. The process is described by Moses Lieb Lilienblum. He says, I was weary and exhausted from studying the Talmud, its disputations and various absurdities. And when I heard of something new that was rational, I was drawn to it. Every Haskalah book I came upon, I devoured like the fruits of summer. Undiscriminating, I read everything that came into my hands. The fact that a few people were reading the books of the Haskalah in remote parts of Lithuania did have an influence. It affected the language the Jewish people used. The Maskilim encouraged use of Russian as the language of the state and of German as the language of culture and science, rather than Yiddish. It also affected the clothes that people wore, and it affected gender relations, in that it encouraged men to be more active in mainstream economic activity. Traditional Jewish life in the shtetl was also being changed by the growth of the economy and improved transport systems. The development of the railways was particularly important because it connected remote parts of Lithuania to Baltic ports. I suggest in the book that perhaps one needs to think of the late 19th century shtetl not just as poverty-stricken, remote, and stuck in its ways. At one level, it was all of those things, but also as occupying a hinterland to thriving port cities. And these port cities gave access to a wider world of learning and commercial opportunity, which was transforming shtetl life rather quickly. The end of the 19th century saw a great wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. If I could see the next slide, please. And can I see the next slide? Thank you. In fact, can I also see the next slide? Okay, and the next one. Okay, so the end of the 19th century saw a great wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. In the roughly 3.5 decades between 1881 and 1914, about 2.7 million Jewish people migrated to the West from Eastern Europe, being about a quarter of the entire Jewish population of Eastern Europe. We know that about 75% of these Jewish people went to the US and to Canada. About 10% went to Palestine, as it then was. About 10% went to Latin America, and the rest went to other countries. Actually, Britain tends not to appear in migration figures because, in contrast to other destination countries, Britain was often seen as a place of transmigration. In other words, a place where many migrants stayed for a relatively short period before moving on somewhere else. The migration wave was set off by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. This ended the modest liberalism of his regime. In some parts of the Russian Empire, there were pogroms, and many Jewish families have come to think that their forebears left Eastern Europe because they were fleeing pogroms. But actually, there were comparatively few pogroms in Lithuania in the late 19th century. Most of the pogroms of that time were further south. The reason why there were fewer pogroms in Lithuania is not entirely clear, but is probably connected to the outlook of Governor General Tortleben of Vilnius, the Tsarist official with responsibility for maintenance of order in Lithuania. He seems to have thought Jews were relatively sympathetic to Russian cultural influence in Lithuania and could be regarded as more reliable than Poles and Lithuanians. He also seems to have taken the view, rather straightforwardly, that his job was to maintain order. But if Jews did not flee because of pogroms as such, they may very well have fled because of the fear that pogroms would come to them. This intense fear is described in a letter of February 1882 sent by an unidentified Jew in Vilnius to a newspaper editor. He says, "We expected a pogrom during the Christmas holidays, and now our fears have not been allayed, and we expect a pogrom at any minute. If someone gets into an argument with a Christian, the latter immediately says, 'Just wait, soon we will settle all the scores.' What kind of life is this? If I had the courage, I would kill all those close to me and then myself. What a miserable creature is a Jew." Jews also fled Lithuania because of the extraordinary range of Tsarist laws which deliberately targeted them and which made their lives so difficult. In the 1880s, a commission was established by Tsarist authorities under Count Phelan to look into the Jewish question. It identified an astonishing 650 different laws which deliberately discriminated against Jews. These laws controlled where Jews could live and which areas of business they could be involved in. By the late 19th century, these laws had made their lives almost impossible. And many Jews seem to have emigrated because of the fear of being conscripted into the Tsarist army. It's important to note that the worst time for Jews to be conscripted into the Tsarist army was earlier in the 19th century under Tsar Nicholas I, who ruled between 1825 and 1855. His regime used conscription as a way of trying to force Jews to be baptized. Under his rule, young Jewish men were usually conscripted for 25 years. The worst successes of the conscription system had ended by the late 19th century, but the idea of being conscripted was still traumatic. So, fear of pogroms, anti-Semitic legislation that made life almost impossible, fear of being conscripted into the Tsarist army, and the hope of improvement in their economic circumstances were all powerful reasons for leaving late 19th century Lithuania. But how to choose where to go? It seems that most people simply went to places where they already knew people, either family members or friends from their home communities. And this was the phenomenon of so-called chain migration. If I could have the next slide, please. And the next slide. Thank you. But why did anyone choose to go to Ireland? It was perhaps a surprising choice of emigration destination, given the terrible poverty, famine, and sectarian conflict of late 19th century Ireland. In collective memory, the fact that Jews chose to emigrate to Ireland is often characterized as a result of trickery practiced on them by ship's captains or of their own foolishness. Being an Irish Jew was therefore thought of as a kind of accident, albeit one that had a funny side to it and from which amusing anecdotes could be spun. These anecdotes take three main forms. The Jewish migrants were tricked into landing just outside Cork by dishonest ship's captains who had double booked their onward passage to New York. The second kind of anecdote suggests that migrants disembarked thinking they were in the United States, having mistaken cries of Cork for New York or Ireland for the Yiddish Ireland. And the third maintains that the ship's supply of kosher food had run out, and the strictly observant Jews preferred to stay in Ireland rather than starve or eat non-kosher food. The last of these stories is probably the one most based in reality. But, as well as accidental arrival, there were undoubtedly Jews who deliberately chose to go to Ireland. Many of the Jewish migrants travelled through northern English cities such as Manchester and Liverpool on their migratory journey, and they found those cities grey and dirty. They were more attracted by the green and wide open spaces of Ireland, which reminded them of home in Lithuania. Also, most of the immigrants first tried to earn a living as peddlers. Peddling involved carrying goods on their back from door to door and selling them, usually on credit, to Irish housewives. It was important for a peddler not to have too many other Jewish peddlers in the area because they were competition. Ironically, the fact that there were few other Jews in Ireland was precisely what made it attractive to those who did go there. The next question I look at in the book is what happened to Jewish people who stayed behind in Lithuania during the First World War. Can I have the next slide, please? When we think of the First World War, many of us think of the long war of attrition in the trenches on the Western Front. But the experience on the Eastern Front, the war between Germany and Russia, was very different. Here, in 1914 to 1915, German armies enjoyed a record of almost unbroken success. For much of 1914 to 1915, Lithuania was on the front line of the war between Germany and Russia. The continuous black line on this map shows the line of the Eastern Front in 1915. Being on or near the front line made life difficult for Lithuanian Jews. Industrial plants were relocated to the Russian interior, depriving many Lithuanian Jewish workers of their livelihood. And many Jews were ruined when their homes or places of work were damaged in battle. Generally speaking, Lithuanian Jews seem to have responded to the outbreak of war with displays of patriotic allegiance to Russia. Something between 350,000 and 400,000 Jews served in the Russian army. However, Russian military setbacks were embarrassing, and the Russians needed a scapegoat. Jews were accused of spying. Perhaps the closeness of the German and Yiddish languages gave some plausibility to these accusations. By May 1915, about 75 to 80% of the Jewish population of Lithuania had been expelled. Generally, the Jewish population was given less than 24 hours to leave. In a speech in the Russian parliament, the non-Jewish deputy, Dzubinsky, said that as a representative of our 56th Siberian Division, I was myself on the scene and can testify with what incredible cruelty the expulsion took place. The whole population was driven out within a few hours during the night. At 11 o'clock, the people were informed they had to leave, with a threat that anyone found at daybreak would be hanged. Old men, invalids, and paralytics had to be carried on people's arms because there were no vehicles. The Jews expelled from Lithuania were scattered across a wide area of the interior of Russia. It caused great hardship to the people expelled, but, and rather ironically, it brought about a de facto end to the Pale of Settlement because it scattered Jews across a vast expanse deep inside Russia. This mass expulsion changed Jewish life in Lithuania in a way that it never really recovered from. We know that in Pekeliai, the small shtetl that my great-grandfather Meyer came from, The total population in 1897 was 1,758, of whom 1,206 were Jewish. In other words, 68% of the population of that time was Jewish. The expulsions of May 1915 removed all Jews from Bekeliai, and although a small handful returned post-war, the blow inflicted on that community by the expulsions of World War I was one that it never really recovered from. The Jews who returned to Lithuania after the First World War tended not to go back to the smaller towns where their homes and stores had been looted and destroyed. They headed instead for the larger towns, and particularly for Kaunas or Kovno. Many had great difficulties getting back to Lithuania and were caught up in the violence and pogroms which followed the First World War. In my book, I say something about Jewish life in Lithuania during the interwar period and how, in the early post-war years, there was a short period of optimism that Jewish life would improve before storm clouds gathered and the picture darkened. I'm not going to say a lot about the Holocaust today. I do discuss it in detail in the book. I will just make a few big picture points. The first point is to say that the way the Holocaust unfolded in Lithuania was rather distinctive. It was the first country in which the Nazis pursued the policy of killing the entire Jewish population, and this objective was largely achieved. It is estimated that about 96% of the pre-war Jewish population of Lithuania was murdered. The killing was mainly carried out by shooting, not by gas fan or by gas chamber. And most of the shooting was carried out by local Lithuanians, albeit this was often, but not always, under the direction of Germans. The usual pattern was for Jews to be taken to pits on the edge of towns near where they lived. They were forced to dig the pits, and then local Lithuanians shot them and buried the bodies. This, if you can move on to the next slide, please. This map shows the location of these mass execution sites, which, as you can see, stretch right the way across Lithuania. It is also worth saying that the Holocaust in Lithuania went through at least three rather distinct phases. The first phase lasted from the German invasion of June 1941 until December 1941. This was a period of mass murder of the Lithuanian Jews. About 80% of them were murdered in this period. The second period lasted from January 1942 until March 1943 and can be thought of as a relatively quiet period during which German policy concentrated on exploiting Jews for their labor, having first enclosed them in ghettos in Vilnius, Kaunas, and elsewhere. The third period began in April 1943 and lasted until July 1944. This was a period characterized by the gradual liquidation of the existing ghettos and of the surviving Jewish population by a mixture of murder and deportation to camps in Germany. There has been a huge amount of historical research and writing about why many Germans were so attracted to Nazism and became viciously anti-Semitic. I discuss that in the book. Rather less has been said about why significant numbers of Lithuanians engaged in this murderous assault on their Jewish neighbours. It's complicated. Partly it is to do with the development of Lithuanian nationalism in the interwar period and with long-standing anti-Semitic sentiments with deep roots in Christian theology. Part of it, I think, is to do with the anti-Jewish fury which many Lithuanians felt and which arose from the trauma which Lithuania experienced as a result of being occupied by the Soviet Union for about 1 year between June 1940 and June 1941. Many Lithuanians were furious with Jews because they thought Jews had given the Soviets a very warm welcome when the Soviets arrived in Lithuania in June 1940. They also thought Jews had been too active in Soviet administration of Lithuania. Neither of these beliefs contained much truth. Most Lithuanian Jews were emphatically not communist. As to Jewish involvement in administering Soviet Lithuania, the best estimate is that about 12 to 16% of the Communist Party in Lithuania were Jews. This was very modest overrepresentation, but perhaps unsurprising given that Jews were, generally speaking, better educated than ethnic Lithuanians. The anger Lithuanians felt towards Jews may be connected to Lithuanians' trauma, which derived from the fact that Lithuanians did not put up any resistance to Soviet occupation in June 1940. It seems part of the reason for Lithuanians' assault on Jews was the desire to steal their possessions. Many memoirs by Jewish survivors contain graphic descriptions of local people stealing the possessions of their Jewish neighbors. At this point, I'd just like to read you, if I may, a short extract from my book. So I say that testimonies given by survivors to Leib Koniuchowski shortly after the war indicate how commonplace theft was in most of the provincial communities. In Anikskie, for example, Motel Kuritsky said, with tears in their eyes, the Jews saw neighbors happily dragging away all their possessions before the Jews had even left the town. Their homes had been stripped bare. In Gidrakiai, Yisrael Katz said, Jewish possessions were continuously robbed. The partisans used to enter Jewish homes and take whatever they liked. In Tormantas, Mendel Davidson said, using coaches, the partisans took for themselves all the goods and property from the Jewish homes. Others transferred them to the countryside, and what was left was robbed by the townlet's residents. Some members of my wider family were killed in Lithuania during the war. One member of the family survived. Like most of the small handful of those Lithuanian Jews who did survive, she was transferred to the camp at Stutthof, just outside Danzig, towards the end of the war. She was forced to participate in the so-called death marches that were inflicted on many camp inmates at the very end of the war as the Germans tried to move concentration camp survivors away from advancing Allied armies. Organization and discipline broke down, and many of the death marches were seemingly purposeless, with camp inmates just walking round and round in ever smaller circles. These death marches were terrible for those who participated in them. It is thought that of the 750,000 prisoners in the whole concentration camp system at the beginning of 1945, approximately 1/3 died on death marches. By the end of the war, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population of Lithuania had been murdered. How did any Lithuanian Jews survive? Some did so by hiding in so-called malins, being hiding places under houses or in sewers. A very few had survived by fleeing to the woods and joining the partisans. Most of those who survived had fled east into the Soviet Union immediately before the Nazi invasion. For those who returned to their former homes at war's end, the silence, loss, and desolation was overwhelming. Chaim Gray describes returning to Vilnius. All that is left is walls, roofs, pillars, cornices, tottering beams. All that is left is broken bedsteads, the rusty entrails of primer stoves, twisted forks, knives, spoons, without the mouths. And I am left with eyes without tears. I cannot squeeze even a single tear from my eyes. An entire row of shops, shuttered and bolted. Open up, you brigand, open up! But no one laughs, and no one coughs, and no one answers. The final chapter of my book considers how Lithuanian government and society has tried or not tried to come to terms with the Holocaust in Lithuania. The important political background is that at the end of the Second World War, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union. The Western Allies agreed, although not publicly, that post-war Lithuania should be in the Soviet sphere of influence. Lithuanians conducted a sporadic partisan war against the Soviets until about 1953. The Soviets sought to impose Soviet communism on Lithuania and ruthlessly to suppress dissent. they deported many Lithuanians to Siberia. There has been a reluctance or failure in many parts of post-war Lithuanian society fully to come to terms with the magnitude of the horror visited on its Jewish population. I think a number of things account for this. First of all, the Soviet government and Lithuanian governments during the period of Soviet occupation from 1945 to 1990 tended not to acknowledge the uniqueness of the tragedy of European Jewry and obscured the fact that Jews were killed because they were Jews. The Soviet regime described Jewish victims simply as Soviet people, and the killers were not characterized as Lithuanians, but as products of socio-economic classes that were enemies of the proletariat. This was confusing for much of the Lithuanian population. Secondly, many Lithuanians became very caught up with an understandable sense of their own suffering during the period of post-war Soviet domination. In the post-war period, many Lithuanians were deported to Siberia and to the gulags. The best estimate is that between 120,000 and 150,000 Lithuanians were deported. This seems to have made it difficult for many Lithuanians to find space fully to reflect on the fate of their former Jewish neighbors. In 1990, Lithuania became independent. The question of how to deal with the Holocaust quickly became relevant in the context of Lithuania seeking admission to the EU and to NATO, both of which eventually happened in 2004. In that context, a number of matters relating to the Holocaust needed to be addressed, including there needed to be an acknowledgement of guilt for Holocaust crimes and issue of an apology. The victims needed to be appropriately commemorated. Criminal proceedings needed to be brought against perpetrators. The local population needed to be properly educated about the Holocaust. And there needed to be restitution of stolen property. However, the question of whether Lithuanian government and society have adequately tried to come to terms with the Holocaust in Lithuania remains highly controversial. There are descendants of Lithuanian Jews who are concerned, and some of whom are angry, about a number of things, including that many of the memorials put up in the Soviet era do not refer to the fact that the victims being memorialized were Jewish and are silent about the fact that their killers were Lithuanian. That some statues and plaques commemorating Lithuanians who were responsible for Holocaust atrocities remain in place. Although, of course, it should be said that the thinking behind erecting these memorials was to celebrate Lithuanians' efforts to resist the Soviets and not their activities against Jews. That many of the mass graves of the Jewish victims are in a state of neglect. That the smaller regional museums across Lithuania have little material about the Jews who lived in those communities for many centuries. And, of course, some Jewish survivors and their descendants remain angry at the extraordinary wholesale theft of Jewish possessions. I think some of those who are very angry are angry both because of the horror itself, but also because the failure properly to come to terms with what happened is thought to represent a continuing slight to the Jewish community. There is an interesting question about whether any useful purpose is really served by trying to persuade the Lithuanian government and its people to become better informed about Lithuania's Holocaust history and to show more remorse. Advocates of such an approach tend to say that doing so would help ease trauma, both Lithuanian and Jewish, and also that education about the Holocaust would perhaps make it less likely that a comparable event could ever be repeated. Clearly, there are fine intentions and a good deal of idealism behind such thinking, but whether it is right is unknowable. I would like to finish by reading you an extract from the conclusion to my book. So in the book, as I've said, I do show that much of modern Jewish history in Lithuania is really very bleak. But I ask whether any rays of light shine through this story which I have described as being so bleak. One ray of light is to emphasize that for many years, Lithuania was a good place for Jews to live. In the early modern period, Jews were expelled, as I've said, from many European countries. But Jews found refuge in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For some centuries, Jews enjoyed considerable autonomy in Lithuania, and it became a great center for Jewish culture and learning. Another ray of light is that some of the thinking which most sustained hostility to Jews before the Holocaust has changed. It is highly significant that in Nostra Aetate, issued by Pope Paul VI in 1965, the Catholic Church formally absolved Jews from continuing responsibility for the death of Jesus. It says what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. Perhaps a final ray of light is to reflect on the lives of some of the Jews who left Lithuania to make lives elsewhere. They carried with them the traditions and approaches to life and learning acquired either by them or their forebears in Lithuania. They achieved success in various walks of life, including as politicians, writers, musicians, and scientists. They moved to many different countries in the West, including the United States, South Africa, and England. Some, including members of my family, even moved to Ireland and flourished there. But the story of Lithuanian Jews in Ireland, a remarkable, if relatively little known story, is going to be the subject of my next book. If you find this subject interesting, please do buy the book. Probably the easiest way for you to get it is to buy it on Amazon. So I'd like to end there, but I'd be very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for this really enlightening talk, and thank you everyone for all your questions and attention. Sebastian, you wanna start out with the questions?
Yes. Well, first, yeah, you mentioned Nick at the end, South Africa. So yeah, there was a comment pointing out that many Lithuanian Jews actually moved to South Africa. So South Africa is mostly composed by, like the Jewish community in South Africa, by Lithuanian Jews. So that's very particular. So
Yes.
yeah.
Can I just comment on that? Well, it's certainly true that the South African Jewish community is overwhelmingly a Litvak community. Many of them moved there before the First World War. About 40,000 are thought to have done so. And many more moved after the First World War because around the time of the First World War, many immigration law restrictions were enacted in Western countries, particularly in America and Britain, and it became harder for migrating Jews from Lithuania to get into Western countries, but they could still go to South Africa. So I think the immigration law is a part of the explanation for the development of the South African Jewish community from Lithuania. Another explanation, perhaps, is that there was a man called Donald Curry who, in the very late 19th and early 20th century, built a number of ships so as to take Cornish tin miners down to South Africa to participate in the gold rush and in the hunt for diamonds. But then the gold rush kind of petered out, and only relatively few Cornish tin miners wanted to hunt for diamonds in South Africa. So there was Donald Curry left with all these ships which he had no particular use. And bit by bit, you see him investing in the temporary Jews shelter in East London. And he comes to realize that he has these ships and there is an opportunity for him to use them to make money by transferring Lithuanian Jews who had settled on a temporary basis in London down to South Africa. So that, I think, is another reason for the development of the South African Lithuanian Jewish community.
Thank you. I will read one question, then I'll give the word to Morris, who's raising his hand, and then I will continue reading. There are many questions, so I hope we will manage to answer them all. Question from Mark. Did any Jews leave because they were escaping Orthodox Jews dictating their lives? If that was a reason for Jews leaving Lithuania?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've been asked that before. No, I don't think so particularly. I mean, I think that you know, at the time of the mass migration being between 1882 and 1914, most of the Jews who lived in Lithuania were, by modern standards, extremely observant. I mean, clearly, as I said in my talk, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, was making inroads. Some educated Jewish people were beginning to move away from Orthodoxy, but overwhelmingly the community was still a highly observant community. And as I've said, it was a very dispersed community across Lithuania. So I think if they found a particular rabbi difficult in a particular town or shtetl, they could have quite easily moved to another one, frankly. So I haven't heard it suggested seriously that Jews left Eastern Europe generally, and certainly not from Lithuania, because of a sort of dislike of Orthodox rabbis. No, I haven't heard that.
Thank you. Yeah, Maurice, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation. I think you've cleared up a couple of things about my parents' history. I know my parents were from Sholai, from Shabel,
Yeah.
and in the Shabel ghetto, and their children were taken in November of '43 in a children's action, I think, sent to Auschwitz, along with about 500 other children. But I'm not sure about their final destination. And then the Shovel Ghetto was liquidated in, I think, June or July of '44. And I think that my parents were both sent to a camp near Riga, maybe Salaspils. I'm not sure about that.
Probably
But,
Stutthof. I should think Stutthof, but I don't know. Yeah.
well, I know they were in Stutthof, and you mentioned there was a death march from Scholai to Stutthof, so they may have been on that. I'm not exactly sure. But we're going to visit Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia in June and July. We're going to Vilnius, Šiauliai, and Janušak, where my father was born, and then on to Riga. And we still have some things to work out as far as us having a meaningful trip there to be able to sort out what we need. So I have a few friend who has been there who gave us some suggestions about contacting the Jewish community, to get some help and to get a guide because we don't speak the language. So that's what we plan to do.
Well, one piece of advice, get a good guide, because
Yes.
if you go by yourself, I think it's quite difficult to know what to look at and what to see. But if you get a good guide, that makes all the difference. There is a company called Gerulita, Jerulita, which specializes in showing Jews in the West around sites of Jewish interest in Lithuania. It was set up by a man called Julik Gurevich, and his son Daniel is kind of inheriting the business. But
It says Jliuta.
yeah,
We will share.
Jerulita, Gerulita. But I mean,
we-
they are.
We are happy to share the
Yeah.
link. Actually, our trip that Qesher in cooperation with Gerolita organized to the Baltic states this year. We have participants at the moment traveling
nice.
these three countries together with Gerolita and Danielle and their guides.
Okay.
We hope to reorganize this trip sometime in the future. So those of you who are interested in traveling to the Baltic states or Lithuania, please feel free to be in touch with us. We'll be happy to
Yeah.
help you out with that.
I mean, Gerolita is a very good organization. I've used them a lot myself and recommended them to friends. And the guy that set it up, Julik Gurevich, is a remarkable man. He's a Jewish man. He's now in his late 70s, but he has lived in Lithuania all his life. He speaks reasonably well about 10 languages, which is fairly remarkable by any standard. No, he's a good guy.
Yeah, we were recommended to the Jewish Federation in Vilnius in their archives, and also the Jewish Center in Šiauliai to contact them for a guide. But I will contact Gerolita also. So thank you so much. But you said the Jews went. The death march was from Šiauliai to Stutthof, and I know my parents were in
No,
Stutthof.
I said that the death march was it kind of set out from Stutthof and went sort of round and round in circles near Stutthof. I mean, the basic purpose of death marches was to try to avoid the um, the oncoming invasion from the Allies,
Mhm.
to try to move Jews out of the track of the Allied armies, but central command and control had broken down by that point, and therefore it was really down to the sort of local German or German officers to conduct the death marches as they saw fit, and they just became totally chaotic. Many people died of starvation or were shot, and it was a
Yeah.
terrible experience, as I've described.
Yeah, I read a book by Runas Bubnis about the Sholai Ghetto, which was very informative.
Good.
And also, Ruta Banagati spoke here in Houston a few years ago, and it's quite informative.
Good.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Yes, Nick, we still have many questions going, not that much time. So just I'm gonna try to combine some questions to kind of make it a bit faster. So question, so how was life for the Jews in the short period when Lithuania was independent? And what was the estimated population of Jews in Lithuania around that time before the war?
Okay. Well, there were two questions there. I mean, I think the interwar period was initially quite promising for Jews. Of course, it took a while for Jews to get back into Lithuania after the First World War, because as I described, most had been exiled. And after the First World War, Vilnius, which was the largest town, was a part of Poland, and so it was completely cut off from Lithuania. So most of the Jews who came back to Lithuania in the post-First World War period came back not to the shtetls where their families had lived for a long time, but instead to major towns, and particularly to Kaunas or to Kovno. In the sort of first 2 or 3 years of the post-First World War period, I think life was difficult for Jews because they had to get back to Lithuania if that's what they wanted to do. And in the sort of chaos that ensued at the end of the First World War, there was a lot of general violence, and particularly pogroms against Jews. Not so much in Lithuania, but certainly in Ukraine and parts of Belarus. And a lot of Jews got sort of caught up in that. But then after they got back in, I don't know, sort of 1920, 1921, there were a few years where Jews had a certain amount of autonomy and were respected, and it sort of looked as though things were kind of getting a bit better. But from 1926 onwards, quite a sort of strongly right-wing government came to power in Lithuania, which was sort of comparatively unfriendly to Jews. I mean, life was tolerable, but it was not very easy from about 1926 onwards. And then I think after the Nazis came to power, there was this great sense of foreboding. A lot of Jewish people wanted to leave, but of course at that point it was really very difficult for Jews to leave because other countries were so reluctant to take them in, as we know. So the short answer is that, you know, the interwar period wasn't too bad initially from about 1920 to 1926. It then became a bit more difficult. And from the time the Nazis came to power in Germany, I think life became a source of great anxiety to many Lithuanian Jews.
And more or less, how many Jews lived in Lithuania around this time,
Yeah.
specifically in Kaunas also in particular?
Well, I mean, the numbers vary a bit, but I think people think that just before the war, there were something like 220 to 240,000 Jewish people living in Lithuania, in the current borders of Lithuania.
Thank you. And you mentioned something like when the Germans invaded, someone is asking if the Soviet Union offered a safe passage to Russia, to the Lithuanian Jews.
They didn't offer safe passage as such, but a lot of Jews at the time of the German invasion, you know, a lot of Jews immediately realized that their best hope of survival would be to flee east into the Soviet Union. But a lot of the of the Lithuanian partisans tried to prevent the Jews from fleeing east, and the Soviets were not terribly welcoming of them. But as I said in my talk, I think nonetheless it is the case that the Jews from the pre-war population of Lithuania who survived tended to be those who went east immediately before the German invasion, either because they were fleeing the German armies or because they were deported by the Soviet Union. So, ironically, the biggest proportion of Lithuanian Jews to survive the war were those who were deported by the Soviet authorities deep into the Soviet Union, just in the very few days before the German invasion of June 1941.
Thank you. And do you discuss in your book the role of the first Seimas of independent Lithuania and the Jewish Council during the interwar period?
Yes, I do discuss that in the book. I have a whole chapter about the interwar period in the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Question from Nancy that she just read the novel The Enemy Beside Me, and the author talks about the absolute brutality of the partisans against the Jews. She noted that even the Nazis were appalled. Is that so, or is
Well, yes. I mean, I think it was generally quite difficult for Jews to go and join the partisans. I mean, the non-Jewish partisans tended to be made up mainly of kind of male fighters, whereas Jews who went to join the partisans tended to go in family groups, which was awkward for the partisans, should we say. But in addition, I mean, I'm sorry to say, I think a lot of the non-Jewish partisans were not very welcoming of Jewish partisans. So, I mean, a few Jews did go and join the partisans, but they were generally not welcomed, and very few of those who went to join the partisans survived.
Thank you. And can you say something about the Jewish community of Lithuania today? How many
Well, the
Jews live
Jewish
there?
community of
What's the right?
Lithuania today is very small. I mean, I think nobody knows quite how many, but a very few thousand, under 5,000, that sort of number, perhaps less. And it's important to say that those people are mainly made up of the descendants of members of the Soviet administration, which administered Lithuania in the post-war period. They tend not to be descendants of Jewish families who had a long history of living in Lithuania. As I said, most of the overwhelming majority of those people were murdered in the Holocaust, and generally those who went back sort of simply didn't want to stay in Lithuania. They found it, extremely grim. But I do in my book have a chapter about an extraordinary woman called Rivka who survived the war. She witnessed a lot of the Holocaust in Lithuania, and she decided post-war that she would stay in Lithuania. She doesn't altogether explain why she stayed there. I think it was partly because she felt an obligation to try and put some of the Jewish mass execution sites in some kind of order, and she wanted to try to bring to justice some of the people that had committed the atrocities. I don't think she got very far with those efforts, but that's why she stayed there. But she describes in graphic detail, and I do go into it in the book, the experience of living as one of the very few Jews in Lithuania who'd been there before the war, and what it was like. And I think it was pretty difficult experience for her because she'd walk down the street and she would encounter Lithuanians who had known her all her life, who would blank her and ignore her. And she saw people walking down the street wearing the smart clothes that her family had owned. So it was very difficult for her. But I go into that in the book.
Thank you. And do you have any connection to the Sayers family in Pennsylvania? They were originally from Ireland and England.
I don't know.
You may have relatives in Pennsylvania that you don't know about.
I'm not aware of relatives in Pennsylvania, but it's certainly possible. I mean, our family, as I've said, migrated from northern Lithuania to Cork in Southern Ireland in the 1890s. The name before they moved was Qesher, which in Yiddish implies cutting, so they were probably involved in the tailoring industry. On arrival in Ireland, the name was changed to Sayers, possibly because, like most of the Jews who were first in Ireland, they first earned a living as peddlers. And there was a famous bare-knuckle boxer of late 19th century called Tom Sayers, and if you were going to be a peddler in a remote part of Ireland, perhaps it was useful to have a name that conveyed the subliminal message: if you mess with this peddler, you're going to get into trouble. But that's speculation on my part. I don't exactly know why the name was changed to Sayers, but Sayers is a name that some non-Jewish Irish people also have, and there are few Jewish people that have that name.
Thank you. I will read the last two questions, and then I think Maurice wants to say something again. So we will read these two questions, then give the last word to Maurice, and then we will close for today. What is your advice for finding and thus honoring Lithuanian relatives who may have perished in the Holocaust?
My advice for finding those relatives? Well, I mean, there are, of course, quite a lot of online Jewish genealogical sites, including Jewish Gen and others. So I'd have thought using the online genealogical resources is probably the best place to begin. There are also a number of people based in Lithuania who specialize in trying to help Jewish people track down information about their relatives. I mean, I don't think you're likely to find very much. You know, you might find information about sort of dates of birth and marriage and death. But for me, what makes history interesting is when you start finding diaries and letters and memoirs, and unless you're extraordinarily lucky, I fear you probably won't find those. But I think the short answer to the question is a combination of online Jewish genealogical sites and also trying to find an expert in Lithuania or elsewhere in Eastern Europe who could help you, research the relevant archives to get the kind of basic information I've just described. And so, what's another question you asked?
Sorry, Nick?
Yeah, I think another very interesting question is how, if at all, or in what way did this research impact your life, researching your family?
Well, it certainly taught me all sorts of things that I didn't really know before. And I mean, I found this both in doing the research and also in giving talks about it. I am very struck by the fact that lots of Jews in England have some Lithuanian Jewish ancestry. And people tend to know virtually nothing about it. I mean, really, almost nothing. But people are really quite interested in it. And I found that in doing this research, I learned various things about which I previously know nothing, or virtually nothing. I didn't really know anything much about what happened to Jewish people during the First World War, that sort of mass expulsion that I described. I hadn't really appreciated how large a proportion of Lithuanian Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, nor had I quite appreciated the role, unfortunately, that many Lithuanians played in that. I hadn't, perhaps I hadn't quite actually realized the extraordinary sort of Lithuanian Jewish approach to learning, which was distinctive in Eastern Europe, I think, and which goes quite a long way towards explaining how it was that so many of them were able to get on and flourish so comparatively quickly once they emigrated. Because I mean, something I'm thinking about in the context of my next book about Ireland, but it is remarkable to me that within very few years, people who were peddlers should have children who become successful scientists and professional people. And I think that was really only possible because there was this very particular approach to study and a very particular respect for learning that was distinctive of the Lithuanian Jewish community. And I hadn't really quite appreciated that before I started my research. So I think the short answer to your question, Dora, is I've learned all sorts of things about my history that I didn't really know about before, and I hope that I have enabled others of Jewish Lithuanian ancestry and indeed to other people who are Jewish, to learn more about this extraordinary, fascinating history.
And related to this, like someone was asking actually, when was Vilnius considered a major center of Jewish learning? Which centuries?
Well, I think it had as I said, I mean, I think Jews had been in Vilnius since the 14th century, and I think it sort of grew over time as a great center of Jewish learning. It's particularly known for the Vilna Gaon, who was a great rabbi and a very distinguished rabbi and teacher for many people. And a sort of feature of my giving these talks is that after them I usually get one or two people contact me and say, "Oh, but they're a relation of the film The Gaon." So that's the short answer to your question. I mean, I think it really started in the 14th century and built, and kind of in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, Vilna became a great center of Jewish education and learning.
Thank you. So I'll read the last question that I had actually missed before because someone had to ask it twice, and then Morris, and then we close for today. It's getting a bit late here in Europe. Why the Germans did the death marches rather than just leave the prisoners behind in the camps?
Well, I think they didn't want the Allied armies to discover what they had been doing to the Jews. There were various efforts at the end of the war to try to conceal the mass murder of Jews in a rather ineffectual way. But I mean, actually, across Lithuania, a lot of the bodies that had been buried in the mass graves were dug up and burned, so as to try to hide evidence of what had happened. So there was an element of trying to ensure that that Jewish people did not fall into the hands of the Allies and therefore be able to tell them what the Germans had been doing. But I think really the death marches were the product of a breakdown of central command and control in the German authorities, and confusion reigned. So decisions about what to do with the Jews in the camps were in the hands of local, quite lowly German officers who just took decisions at will and in a rather confused way, and chaos reigned, and they changed their mind, and they weren't quite sure where they were marching these people. So they ended up, as I say very often, just marching them around in circles.
Okay, thank you. And yes, Morris, you wanted to again? Yes.
Yes, I know we're over time, but do you have time to talk just a little bit about Ruta Benegata's work and how she was pressured out of Lithuania? I think she now lives in Israel.
Yes, well, she is. I mean, there are a couple of rather distinguished modern Lithuanian women, both her, Ruta Vanagaita, but also there's someone called Sylvia Foti, who actually grew up in the States, but has Lithuanian background. Both of them have tried to write about what happened to Jews in Lithuania, and I think because they thought it was important to educate Lithuanians about what had really happened. And both Vanagaita and Foti have had a very difficult time. I mean, they've sort of I mean, Vanagaita had her books withdrawn from bookshops. She had to leave Lithuania. She had to have security for a period of time in Lithuania. But she's a very brave woman, and she's very determined to try and educate younger people in Lithuania about what happened. which is very admirable, because it's certainly my impression that the Lithuanian government says it's trying to make sure that younger Lithuanians know what happened, but I can only say that many of the younger Lithuanians that I have met in the course of giving talks seem to know astonishingly little about what happened. I don't mind telling you that while writing this book, my second daughter was doing a PhD in Oxford, and she was actually sharing a house with a Lithuanian student, whose parents medics in Vilnius, and a very nice and very educated girl, but she knew nothing about the history of the Holocaust in Lithuania. And I think that's unfortunately quite typical. So I think Ruta Vanagaita is trying to ensure that this story is better known, and that's very important, and she's very courageous.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that there are so many comments and questions in the chat, and unfortunately, in the time frame we set out this talk to, we don't have time to read all of them. But I really encourage everyone who is curious about this topic to buy Nick's book, and perhaps you will find answers in his book. I am pretty sure that many of the topics that you're asking about are discussed, and we hope you will find answers. And of course, we also regularly do talks about Lithuania and Baltic states, actually with Daniel from Gerulita. So you can let us know if you're interested in joining our further sessions about Lithuania, and we'll be happy to let you know if there are sessions coming up in this topic. So I just want to thank Nick for answering so many questions, even over time. It was really, really informative, and thank you so much for sharing about your book with us. And of course, thank you everyone for being here and for your activity in the chat and your enthusiasm and interest and curiosity. We really appreciate it, and we hope you'll read the book and find out a lot more about your questions. So I'll just give a few closing words back to Nick, and then we will close for today.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for hosting me. I've enjoyed talking to you all. And if you find this subject interesting, please do buy the book, The Jews of Lithuania: A Journey Through the Long 20th Century. It's available on Amazon and other leading bookshops. So thank you for listening, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll send out to you all this information tomorrow, so you'll receive it in your inbox. If you don't, feel free to let us know, and we'll send it to you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night or a very nice rest of your day, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you all very soon. Our next event will be this Sunday, a little bit earlier than normal. So please check the time of the event. It will be about Jerusalem as a modern city. So it will focus on the areas of Baka and the German colony, which are not the old town. You are welcome to join us then. We'll send you information about our upcoming events as well. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you very soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.